Better? Yeah. All right. Someone just holler at me if I need to speak louder. I am excited to talk about these two topics that are of particular interest to me because they continue to shape who I am. The Black church, the mystic tradition. I'm going to kind of talk about each of them almost separately, and along the way, we'll see where it takes us. Also, I'm going to try not to be long-winded, but I've got a couple thousand words here in my manuscript, and hopefully we'll get through them. But I want to begin this talk about outlining some of the historical context, at least in the way that I like to tell the story, the historical context that gives rise to what we now call the Black church. So I'm going to lean on a few different thinkers to shape this discourse. You'll see them here on the screen, just a few of them, including Al Raboteau. We'll talk about Dwight Hopkins, Gary Dorian, Howard Thurman, and Barbara Holmes. Thurman and Holmes, of course, are mystics that I want to highlight during our time together because they have been so formative for and a blessing to me in my own life. But along the way in this conversation, we'll bump into a few others that are not traditionally thought of as part of the mystic tradition, but whom I believe ought to be thought of as kind of prototypical practitioners within the tradition itself. Now, of course, Howard Thurman is a known name. Many of us are comfortable with Howard Thurman. He remains the foremost African-American within the mystic tradition that we know of. And for Barbara Holmes, who actually has a Memphis connection, she was on the faculty of the Memphis Theological Seminary for many years. She highlights for us, as a descendant of the Gullah people of South Africa, that in her own story, in her own family, Barbara Holmes occupies the role of a shaman. She comes from a long line of shamans, which means that for her, she is responsible for communing with the ancestors, for discerning signs and messages conveyed by the spirit, and for telling the story. Barbara Holmes is going to help us because she points toward the idea that mysticism is not the story of great men and women, thinkers and texts, but that mysticism is a kind of daily discipline of being open to communion with the divine in both the quotidian and extraordinary ways. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. I said we were going to start with history, so let's do a bit of history. And let me also say, in undergrad, I was a history major, so I love this stuff. I'm a history nerd at heart. So before we get to the Black church as we recognize it today, we must first visit the place where it was birthed. So Al Raboteau, of blessed memory now, was the Putnam Professor of Religion at Princeton University for over 25 years. He wrote the text on the screen there at the end, Slave Religion, a seminal work in the study of Black religion. He locates, as many scholars do, the birth of the Black church in the belly of the slave ships. In the belly of the slave ships as they made the terror-inducing journey across the Atlantic. It was there in those slave ships, ships that were named Success, Desire, Hope, even Jesus. In the belly of those slave ships, enslaved Africans began what Raboteau identifies as a process of syncretism. Syncretism is the actively transforming, renegotiating, reorganizing, and redefining the clashing belief systems of the faith of their forebearers and the faith that their enslavers professed. The Africans that were stolen and enslaved had a robust and discernible belief system prior to enslavement. Now, speaking in general terms, the beliefs that the enslaved Africans brought with them to these shores included a few different things. First and foremost, they had an understanding of their relation to the divine. That relationship was mediated through a number of things, including sacrifice, divination or prophecy, and an experience of communion with the divine. Secondly, it included the existence of a transcendent and benevolent God, and it understood the immanence or the materiality, the nearness of God, and for some, a host of gods. And lastly, that belief system included a belief in the power and role of spirits or the spirit, and its ability to enter into and work through human beings, as well as be represented within nature. Those kind of three major pieces of that spirituality, if we're painting with a broad brush. But in short, enslaved Africans were not blank canvases upon which the mural of Christianity was painted, but rather enslaved Africans seeing a version of Christianity presented to them by those who claimed to own them, painted their own version of the mural, incorporating their palette and style into the final work of art that is the Black church. Now, painting metaphor aside, the formation of the Black church was hard won. Christianity and slavery were somehow intimate bedfellows. For as it turned out, Christianity was both the mechanism by which and the justification for the enslavement of millions of African bodies. It was within a Christian logic of, quote unquote, making disciples that missionaries became not only complicit, but drivers of slavery. One missionary, Friedrich Noble, in their diary attested, the slaver depended on the missionary to complete his cargo. And furthermore, it was these missionaries who would sell Africans into the trade for, quote, a flask of wine for the celebration of the sacraments. It's from this logic in 1664 that the state of Maryland passed a law, the first among many laws, ensuring that baptism did not equal manumission. In other words, because an enslaved person becomes a Christian and enters into the fellowship of faith via baptism, this does not make them free. And so, while religious instruction and formation was permitted for the sake of freeing an enslaved person's soul, their bodily freedom was expressly prohibited. And they were made to serve durante vita, for life, at the pleasure of their enslavers. Now jump with me, if you will, about a century to somewhere around the start of the Second Great Awakening, that incredible revivalistic period in our history. It's post-American independence. As the 1700s are drawing to a close, this religious revival, as opposed to the First Great Awakening, which had such a focus on religious instruction and religious education and a respect for a learned clergy, this Second Great Awakening put a focus on a personal connection and experience with God that leads to conversion. The Second Great Awakening is grounded in its individualistic and personal approach to faith. It sounds rather American, doesn't it? It centers a faith that is informed by an experience that leads to an inward personal conversion. But within the Black church tradition, what makes the Second Great Awakening so revolutionary is that in addition to giving us this language about a personal experience with Christ, it also embodied a more inclusive form of Christianity. The Second Great Awakening is famous for its camp meetings, and those camp meetings that are indicative of that Second Great Awakening, white revivalists would preach to enslaved and enslavers alike, to folks who had money and privilege, as well as folks who were laborers. And it's from this place where everyone is worshiping together, and thus worshiping and making claims about the same God, that the mission of to evangelize the enslaved takes off. And this will be great, an egalitarian and inclusive practice of Christianity that gives a vision of every human being as the beloved child of God, except some of these children are enslaved by others. And so things begin to shift. This egalitarian ethos, if you will, of the camp meeting is eventually met with a swift backlash, resulting in legal limits in the ability of the enslaved and those who enslaved to worship together. And it even extended the oversight and surveillance of enslaved people into spaces of worship. So not only are you watched in the field, you're watched while you're trying to worship. It was so totalizing that Black folks freed or enslaved were not allowed to represent themselves in white denominational assemblies, nor were they allowed to preach without a white person present, even in the very faith communities that they established themselves. So what I'm trying to highlight is this foundational tension between Christianity and slavery, between sacred spaces and surveillance, freedom of spirit and bondage of the body that gives way to the emergence of the Black church. It didn't happen in the sanctioned plantation sanctuaries and the places where enslaved folks were surveilled, but it happened in the brush arbors. Brush arbors, that's an important term. Let's turn over to Dwight Hopkins, another scholar who helps us to understand that enslaved people responded to all of those foundational tensions and the almost constant surveillance they were under by withdrawing to the brush arbors to, quote, turn loose and worship God for themselves in their own way and on their own terms. It was in the brush arbors where the enslaved stole away to worship God on their own terms and where a theology emerged born of their inherent beliefs as African peoples and their encounter with Christianity as practiced by those who enslaved them. One such practitioner of the faith that I like to argue is part of the mystic tradition, and many of you are probably familiar with him, is Nat Turner. He's famous for leading a violent rebellion against slavery in Virginia, but is often overlooked about Nat Turner was that he was a deeply religious person who discerned the voice and will of God through experiences of visions, interpreting natural phenomena such as the eclipse of the sun, and direct communications with God. He chronicled all this before he was executed of how the Lord had shown him specific things through sign and vision, an experience common among those who we understand to be traditionally part of the mystic tradition, that the viscerality of the signs and visions that they're having. Now it was from the brush arbor that Nat Turner discerned the signs of God and launched his rebellion. And it was also from those same brush arbors where the enslaved made claims about God for themselves, believing that God had a special concern for the oppressed. Now, added to this was also the fact that the enslaved understood God's presence with a sense of immediacy, that God was the God of history and was thus working to bring about the liberation of God's people, whether it be freeing the Hebrews from Pharaoh or America from British tyrannical rule. God's hand was at work, and thus God's hand must be at work bringing about the liberation of them from those who held them in bondage. This liberationist bent will not go away. And indeed is the result of the syncretism that we began this discussion with. It was a redefinition, a reinterpretation. They were reinterpreting the theology of those who were holding them in bondage with this logic that God was the justification and the reason behind their suffering, replacing it with the theology that prioritized human dignity and agency and God's immediacy in human life. As Hopkins points out, for the enslaved, quote, one does not dichotomize God's sovereignty in any sphere. African traditional religions did not see the possibility of saving the spirit or the soul while the freedom of the body went unattended. Now, another major difference between the theological beliefs that were emerging between for the Black church is the view of humanity and the common responsibility one human life owes to another. Again, let me lift up Hopkins, who says this: such a theological view of humanity, where there's this common responsibility to one another, such a theological view cuts across bourgeois notions of Christianity's individualism and me-firstism. It seeks to form a group solidarity and identity, beginning with God, proceeding through the ancestors to the community and immediate family, and continuing even to the unborn. One cannot be a human being unless one becomes a part of, feels a responsibility to, and serves the community. We're going to come back to this sense of community again and again in our talk. The enslaved were in a real sense and in real time redefining what it meant to be human, even as they were being told they were not human. And so as the enslaved stole away into the brush to worship God on their terms, those brush arbors became a space where agency was able to be exercised, redefined, and reimagined. From the brush arbors, the first institutional Black churches began to take shape. Now, I like to stress to my Methodist and Baptist siblings who think that the National Baptist and Progressive Baptist and the Christian Methodist Episcopal and the African Methodist Episcopal and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion denominations have a monopoly on the Black church. By the way, those are the historically and traditionally recognized historically Black denominations. That's in addition to the Church of God in Christ. But I like to especially remind my Baptist and Methodist siblings that it just so happened that those forms of polity and the engagements of those traditions took root the best. They don't have a monopoly on the Black church. The Black church as an institution is structured by those denominations, but it expands far and wide to wherever Black people worship. And this is the important part, because there's a caveat. It extends to wherever Black people worship and where the commitments of the brush arbor are lived out. A commitment to life and community. A vision of a world that is free of dominance and abuse. A belief that God is at work in the world, wielding history to bring about justice and liberation. And a commitment to the belief that all people are children of God and are thus deserving of freedom. As Barbara Holmes, who we'll meet a little bit later, argues, the Black church was not just a faith community, but was also a locus of social power. In the worst of times, houses of prayer and brush arbors offered a modicum of protection from dangerous public spaces. It was in those safe spaces and worship times that the potential for a beloved community began to crystallize into a landscape. And let me also say the institutional Black church, like any institution, ebbs and flows in its ability to live into those commitments that I outlined, but they persist. And above all, the Black church provides a continuous brush arbor for Black folks to come away for a while from a world that is often deeply opposed, sometimes to the point of violence, for what it stands for. Now, I've tried to offer a sketch of the historical context that gives rise to the Black church and the theological commitments that give it its shape and its significance. And I also hope that you've begun to hear the echoes of where we're heading. The earliest expressions of African spirituality that directly lead to the Black church are clear about the fact that to be in relationship with the divine is to have an experience of communion with the divine. The divine is immanent, immediate, has material resonance in human life. This spirituality was clear that the spirit was real and is able to, and often does, work within the world using human lives and bodies, as well as through nature. In addition to this, the enslaved Africans added a belief that the divine is invested in liberation and justice, and that to be human requires one to be an active participant in the life of the community. Now, as we turn to the mystic tradition, I want to restate what Barbara Holmes points us towards, which is that the experience of divine union, which grounds so much of the mystic tradition, is open and available to everyone, not just the ones whose stories we know, those stories that we are familiar with, like the visions of the crucified Christ as recounted by St. John of the Cross, or the totalizing realization of love as experienced by Thomas Merton in Louisville on 4th and Walnut. They're not indicative of some exclusive kind of mystic experience, but rather they're emblematic of the kinds of experiences that are open to each of us who seek the divine. Now, another story that you might not be familiar with that I want to highlight as part of the mystic tradition is that of Jarena Lee. Jarena Lee, she was born into a free family in New Jersey. She converted to Christianity as an adult, and she became the first woman licensed to preach the gospel in the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1819. She has an account of her call to preach that I encourage you to read in its entirety. It's readily available online. But in it, she recounts this story that speaks to the kind of communion she was experiencing with the divine that shaped her life and ministry. Got it up on the screen, but I'll read it out. Between 4 and 5 years after my sanctification, on a certain time, an impressive silence fell upon me, and I stood as if someone was about to speak to me, yet I had no thought in my heart. But to my utter surprise, there seemed to sound a voice which I thought I distinctly heard and most certainly understood, which said to me, "Go preach the gospel." I immediately replied out loud, "No one will believe me." Again, I listened, and again, the same voice seemed to say, "Preach the gospel. I will put words in your mouth, and you will turn your enemies to become your friends." At first, I supposed that Satan had spoken to me, for I had read that he could transform himself into an angel of light for the purpose of deception. Immediately, I went into a secret place and called upon the Lord to know if he had called me to preach and whether I was deceived or not. When there appeared to my view the form and figure of a pulpit with a Bible laying thereon, the back of which was presented to me as plainly as if it had been a literal fact. In consequence of this, my mind became so exercised that during the night following, I took a text and preached it in my sleep. I thought there stood before me a great multitude while expounding to them the things of religion. So violent were my exertions and so loud were my exclamations that I awoke from the sound of my own voice, which also awoke the family of the house where I resided. A pulpit and a Bible and a preaching experience unfolding before her in a vision, so real as if it were literal fact. Jarena Lee's conviction that she had seen visions from the Lord and heard the Lord call her to preach were indeed doubted. As a woman and as a Black woman in the 19th century, no one believed her claims nor thought it appropriate for her to preach. She went to Richard Allen, the founder of African Methodism, a number of times before he finally licensed her to preach, after finally hearing her preach and realizing that indeed it was the call of the Spirit. Her experience reminds me of Teresa of Avila, whose visions and subsequent actions inspired by her faith were met with hostility and criticism and rejection. Let's keep pressing on, because we all got to get to worship in about 30 minutes anyhow. Let's keep pressing on. Now, a more familiar figure within the mystic tradition, as I mentioned earlier, is Howard Thurman. Now, Thurman's mysticism is less populated with accounts of visions and clear signs from God, and is more centered on a practice of contemplation aimed at experiencing divine union. But in contrast to other mystics, Thurman was concerned about embodying a form of mysticism that sought to make a moral impact on the world. Not one that was solely grounded in the idea of self-denial and personal self-control. With Thurman, his practice of mysticism merged spiritual unity and revelation with social concern and justice. Thurman understood the desire of mysticism to achieve ultimate good through communion with the divine, to be bound by the requirement to respond to human need. They were inseparable. You can't just want to seek communion with God and ultimate good unless you are also responding to human need. In Thurman's view, this way of engaging in the mystic tradition automatically draws you into proximity with the oppressed and into the crosshairs of the systems and circumstances that do the oppressing. It's part of what gave rise to his most famous work, Jesus and the Disinherited. If you've not cracked that book open, I encourage you to do so because it's so clarifying into the ways that we engage with one another. Thurman was haunted for most of his early life by the question, what does the religion of Jesus have to say to people who stand with their backs up against the wall? Those who are the disinherited, the poor, the disenfranchised, and the dispossessed. Thurman's concern with the disinherited and what Jesus has to say to them turned on the fact that the disinherited and the disinheritors are mutually bound to one another by relationship and proximity. They can no more escape one another than they can exchange one body for another. And Thurman believed that because of an inability or unwillingness to acknowledge this truth, each side turns to broken means of relating to one another, whether it be through deception, hate, or fear. Broken means of relating to one another that compromise the ability to be in full communion with one another, and thus to be in communion with the divine. In Thurman's words, and it's actually one of my favorite quotes of his, he says in Jesus and the Disinherited, man's relation to man and man's relation to God are one relation. Again, Thurman wasn't using the inclusive language we're familiar with now, using man in the sense of humankind. But that idea that how I relate to you, how you relate to me, and how I relate to God and how you relate to God are one form of relation. And an inability to understand how to be in communion with one another makes it impossible for us to be in communion with God. For Thurman, his practice of contemplation was the vehicle for his engagement with mysticism. As much like his reason for being a Christian, if you read through Thurman's writings, he often talks about the religion of Jesus, not Christianity, because he had a suspicion that Christianity in its institutional form could often be manipulated and co-opted, but the religion of Jesus in its purest form was about that kind of relationship. Mysticism for Thurman was his way of pursuing the integration of self that is necessary for an experience with the divine, an experience with the divine that helps to direct how one was called to respond to the world. In short, for Thurman, mysticism cannot be just about self-denial, withdrawal, and monastic living. Mysticism has to be responsive to the world around us. It has to be responsible to the community. Here goes that community word again. Because I believe the centrality of community is a defining feature of the mysticism within the Black tradition. For me, a personal story highlights this that I think I've got enough time to share. I've referenced my grandmother a few times from the pulpit here at Idlewild, but I haven't always been precise. I have two grandmothers, like most folks, but one was biological and the other was kind of adopted, if you will. Now in my family, my mother is the mystic, if you will. And she, like Barbara Holmes, communes regularly with the ancestors and is the most connected to the world of spirit. When my mother was in the process of buying the house I grew up in, as a first-time home buyer, she was nervous, to say the least. She'd grown up in Brooklyn, and this house was all the way in Queens. And though she knew the family that we were buying the home for, she had her concerns. And so one evening, doing her due diligence, she got the keys from the family that owned it, and she popped by that evening to see how the neighborhood flowed at night, but also to walk the house and to pray and to hear what she could from God. So my mother told me this story that she was walking through the house, slowly praying, trying to hear from God if this was her home. She began to make her way up the stairs, and as she looked up to the top of the stairs, there standing on the landing stood my grandfather. Problem was my grandfather had died 10 years ago. Now, of course, my mother was shocked. but my grandfather's smile steadied her. She finished climbing the stairs, and my grandfather took her hand and walked the rest of the house without saying a word. Soon after that experience, she closed on that house that I grew up in. There he is in the middle of the screen. He was raised a Baptist, and when he got to New York, he became a Pentecostal preacher along with my grandmother there on the left side. And again, I mentioned those two grandmothers. My mother's mother, right here, and my adoptive grandmother, there on the very end. Now, shortly after my mother closed on the home and we moved in, my biological grandmother and my mother had a conversation that shaped the rest of our lives. My mother tells this story that as they sat talking, my grandmother said, "You know that lady that lives next door to you?" She then went on to describe Annie Miller, the woman who became my adoptive grandmother, in striking detail. The thing is, they had never met a day in their life. "You know that lady that lives next door to you? Give her a spare key to your house." My mother, being the dutiful daughter that she was, listened to my grandmother, not knowing much about Miss Miller, and Miss Miller not knowing much about her, accepted. Mrs. Annie Saunders Miller became a mother and grandmother to my family in the months and years following my biological grandmother's death, which happened within a year of us moving in. And I think that my biological grandmother and God conspired in the knowledge that we need Miss Miller in our lives to help us go where God was leading. It was Miss Miller who took me to Vacation Bible School at Dunton Presbyterian Church, where she was clerk of session, and thus where my engagement with the Presbyterian Church began. The last story that I want to share concerning my grandfather was that when I told my mother that there was this opportunity in Memphis, and I think that's where I needed to go. I had been all over the place. It wasn't uncommon for me to not be near my mom, but something about it really shook her. And she was just not okay with it. And she was like, if you got to, but I just don't know. And then one day she called me and said, "I had a dream. Your grandfather came to me." And in the dream, my grandfather, who hadn't said anything when they were walking through the house, spoke. And he said, "Don't worry. That's where that boy needs to be. He'll be fine." And with love and with understanding, she sent me off to Memphis. She probably does wish I would have come back by now. But the mystic tradition, as part of the Black church tradition, is about community. It's about community that continues to wrap itself around you, not just in the present moment, but also when it concerns ancestors from the past, and as we'll talk about also, that which is not yet. Now I want to take a final turn to Barbara Holmes, who I've been mentioning throughout my talk. And because she may not be as familiar, I think I can squeeze in a video of her introducing herself. If it'll work, we'll see. And if not, then maybe you won't hear from her. There I go messing stuff up. All right. Doesn't look like it's going to work. Barbara Holmes is also on the faculty of the Center for Contemplation and Action, founded by Richard Rohr. If you head on to the website, you'll see this intro video that talks about her role and her experience of being the shaman in her family and what that means for what she can and can't do, and how she moves throughout the world. But it's particularly her understanding of community that I think is central to the mystic tradition within the Black church. Barbara Holmes describes community as a community called beloved. She wrestles with that idea of the beloved community because she thinks it might have been cheapened over the years, right? But this idea of a community called beloved, she defines it as a reconciled collective of caring people. Within this community called beloved, mutual obligation to one another and belonging takes center stage. In this sense, obligation is not legalistic, as we might think about it. It's not weighed down by a sense of duty, but rather quote, obligation is the awareness of our intrinsic connectedness to one another. In other words, for Barbara Holmes, mysticism flies in the face of rugged American individualism and paints a broader picture of where oneself, friends, and relations from a past that has gone by, as well as those coming from a future not yet, those that are deemed different and even adversarial, as well as creation, created, and the creator, they all dwell together in a community called beloved, reconciled and caring in this world that is yearning for unity with God. Mysticism for Holmes is a process of recovering the authentic self through an unmasking of all the unhelpful ways that we try to structure the world with our words and thoughts and actions. It's the quest for truth that can help us get past the barriers that threaten community as beloved. This is hard work, as she points out, for while we speak about a community called beloved, or even a beloved community, or a sense of divine union, as we speak about all of those things, our shadow talk or our shadow opposite is actually participating and engaging in practices that do not seek union, but prioritize the maintenance of radical individualism and autonomy at the expense of those who we have deemed socially expendable. Now, Barbara Holmes is new to me, and I'm still engaging her thoughts and wisdom, but the way that she lives out her mysticism, especially in her book that I had on the screen a bit earlier, Race and the Cosmos, is particularly intriguing to me because she expands the conversation to point us toward the possibility that the union we seek with God is encoded in the very fabric of the universe, from the smallest atom to the mystery of how dark matter holds the universe together. It's an incredible book, and I really recommend it to you. It's truly exciting language and wisdom that is giving me new language to talk about and think about and live out my faith. All right, I think I've talked enough. It's about 9:40. Appreciate you meandering with me, and I like to say meander because we've been all over the place with my thoughts about the Black church and the mystic tradition. In the few moments that are left, I guess I'll open for any questions or comments or thoughts. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.